Hello, this is Martin Carkson. I'm a professor in communication studies at Colorado State University and the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This video is a third in a series. The first of the series kind of focused on the basic reality of wicked problems that we're facing in our communities. The second of the series focused on how, looking at brain science and social psychology, about how our brains and then our institutions and many of our processes are particularly kind of badly suited for wicked problems. In this third video, which I'll actually probably do different versions of this third video depending on the specific audience, focuses on, once we understand those first 2 points, what can we do, particularly in our local communities? How can we build kind of capacity for the kind of conversations our democracy requires? So this particular version of the third video is going to be geared particularly to kind of city employees, to city managers, city staff, and city leaders that are looking to kind of build capacity in their local communities. So I'm going to pull up the slideshow here. So again, the first 2 points kind of covered in the earlier videos. So we're now getting to the good news now. The good news being that once we understand the kind of reality of wicked problems, and we understand kind of the how our brains work and how many of our institutions do not work, we can kind of start taking the steps that are necessary to improve things at the local level. So I'm actually going to kind of walk through 5 kind of broad steps for local community. This is still going to be a pretty kind of a 10,000 foot kind of flyby in a way, and we could certainly kind of with longer time dig into all these kind of specific points a lot more. So I'll be pointing to some different references, materials that can kind of build on these kind of points. These points are organized from short term to long term. The first one, adopting wicked problems mindset, is very short term. It's basically that if you kind of buy my argument from these 3 videos, you can start adopting a wicked problems mindset kind of right away. So the overall kind of idea of a wicked problems mindset is to look at most problems from this wicked problems lens. So the first point here is to presume wicked problems, not wicked people, to kind of shift the basic way your brain wants to think, and assume from the beginning that the reason this is a difficult problem is because the inherent kind of underlying values and tensions between those different kind of values. And I do purposely kind of pick presume there, not assume in all cases. Yes, there are in some cases wicked people and issues that are beyond kind of the wicked problems frame. But I will argue that most tough issues in many ways, I think, do fit the wicked problems frame, or at least the wicked problems frame is the most likely to really make progress moving forward. Second point is to become more comfortable with uncertainty, or in particular the flip side of that, to be less comfortable with certainty. To realize most issues are difficult, and if your brain is telling you it's simple, and you can't even fathom people kind of being against you, that should kind of raise some alarm bells in some ways. That has a particular kind of link to leadership. I've been doing a lot more with leadership programs, and kind of a shift from traditional leadership focus to more facilitative leadership focus. That the leadership of the 20th century, which is more strong opinion and charisma and really being able to rally the troops and kind of push them forward, doesn't work very well with wicked problems. And it actually, you can mobilize the like-minded, you can potentially even win elections, but when it gets to the governing spot, when it gets to kind of solving problems together, that traditional leadership can often kind of bring up a lot of competition, a lot of kind of pushback in a lot of ways. So I do believe the leaders of the 21st century are still going to be leaders, but they're going to be strong on process. Their key skill set is going to be able to bring people together across perspectives and really kind of help us move forward on these tough issues. Third point is the need to focus on elevating the conversation, not just winning the argument. When you walk into a situation dealing with a difficult problem, not walking in to try to kind of convince people they're right, that you're right, but really walking in to see what can I do to make this a better conversation. It's really the assumption there of a trust in the process, that if the process goes well, that they should get to the argument that you think is the strongest in some. So the more we get our leaders, but also kind of a key cadre of our community people, and we'll get into this a little bit later in this discussion, that take on that mindset, that their identity is tied up in elevating the conversation versus winning the argument, you'll start seeing a significant change in the quality of public discourse. Right? And the last here is, from the wicked problems mindset, putting your energy into identifying, engaging, and negotiating those inherent tensions. When you're going into an issue, again, think about what are the underlying values that people often don't talk about directly, that they often kind of just pick one side and build an argument from that. How do you tease that out? And really being able to identify those and put those on the table and help people work through them becomes a critical skill. And then the last one is, and this is kind of pulling from Peter Senge's work in the fifth discipline, how can we create our communities to be these ongoing learning communities? That we don't just kind of solve problems, that it's more of an ongoing conversation, constantly kind of tweaking things, trying to find better ways to negotiate the inherent tensions between the issues that we're dealing with, but constantly kind of learning and pushing back against the feeling of certainty from earlier. One way to kind of summarize this is 4 key shifts that I've been thinking about lately. So one is that shift from assuming wicked people to wicked problems, and how that changes the conversation from the very beginning. And when we do that, to go back to the human nature and social psychology work, we switch from inciting the worst of human nature, that simplicity, that simple narrative, the good versus evil, to bringing out the best of human nature, which I'll tap into in just a second, which is the importance of kind of creativity and purpose that we all have in us. As we make that shift, we switch from being kind of in the adversarial mode to being the collaborative mode. And that's a big shift, because when we're in adversarial mode, our brains are just not working very well, right? Our brains are working overtime to defend our perspective from attack, and to attack others. When we switch to collaborative mode, all of a sudden, again, we're tapping into the best of human nature. And then for those, particularly the experts, for those who really kind of are metric driven, the fourth shift here, which is critical, when we're in adversarial mode, facts do not play the role that we need them to play, right? Facts become kind of ammunition. We use them if they fit. We ignore them if they don't fit. Whereas when we shift to the collaborative mode, now facts can be used as tools. We want good information to solve problems together. So that becomes a big shift in a lot of ways for us to work. And those 4 shifts together are kind of a key aspect of taking on the wicked problems mindset in our communities. The second kind of shorter term step is to begin kind of providing our community with better processes. In particular, when we have better processes, we tap into different aspects of human nature. Earlier, I kind of summarized some of the bad, kind of the key problems with the typical types of public processes we rely on in public engagement. And so really, as you start thinking about kind of making short-term shifts in your process, is to avoid these 4 things, right? To try to engage people earlier in the process, to avoid issues that are framed just as a yes or a no to a specific kind of policy, to get away from just providing opportunities for expression, the wanted time in the microphone or letters or those type of things. And when you do that, when you actually provide people a chance for interaction and kind of learning from each other, and you're asking kind of broader questions versus a yes/no question, you really start engaging people in much different ways. And the science behind this is there, right? So earlier I kind of walked through the worst of our brains of why in some ways we get polarized, and why a particular 2-party system, but also a public engagement that focuses primarily on yes/no issues seems to not work very well. The flip side of this is, as I did this research for 2 years, there was some good trends. There was some good news. Unfortunately, the good news is the good parts of our brain are harder to trigger, right? It's much easier to trigger the negative. It's much more natural, much more evolved in some ways. But we can design processes that, A, avoid triggering the bad, and then B, actually kind of now start triggering the good. And that's really our best shot at having the kind of conversation we want to have. So what is some of that good news? First is we are inherently social and seek purpose and community. What that means is we're not kind of primarily self-interested, right? We want to kind of make connections. This is the positive side of the kind of being groupish, right? Being groupish has justified some of the worst things we've ever done, but it's also justified some of the best things humans have ever done. So a lot of it is, how was the group defined? And that's one of the reasons I'm so drawn to kind of local community democracy, is because that group could be your local community, right? Instead of Democrats or Republicans or whatever kind of things tend to divide us, all of a sudden we care about Fort Collins, or we care about Durango. So that can kind of change the conversations, and it starts emphasizing what kind of connects us versus what divides us. Some of the research here, Daniel Pink, there's another nice little TED talk you can Google on Daniel Pink's book called Drive, of what motivates us, that we're not motivated by self-interest. We're not actually motivated that much by money, but we're motivated by things like purpose and autonomy and mastery. And how can we start tapping into those kind of unconscious motivations in the work that we do in our communities? Second, we're inherently empathetic. We care about other people. That is a basic kind of human nature. Yes, it can be limited in some ways. It does more naturally come up with people that look similar to us, but that is something that can kind of be built and kind of can grow on in a lot of ways with our processes. The most important, which I've already touched on a little bit, is I really do believe that the defining feature of the human species is that we're pragmatic and creative, right? And that's where we need our processes, we need our public engagement to tap into this, to tap into our pragmatic side, to tap into our collaborative kind of possibilities. And when we frame things into simply, when we have adversarial processes, it more strongly taps into the simple good versus evil narrative that doesn't require any kind of creativity. And then last, we can overcome our bad tendencies and build better habits. Yes, our brain has some natural kind of tendencies in some ways, but we're learning more and more that those tendencies can be rewired. We can learn, particularly in individual organizations and individual communities. We can start building up a culture of collaboration. And that's really some of the long-term things that we hope to do with this deliberative engagement. Going back to the research that shows that facts don't change minds. That even in some ways, the stronger the fact, the more it might kind of backfire in some ways. What the research does show that what does change people's minds are those kind of genuine conversations with people they trust. That's when people have the aha moments. That's when they have the shifts in their brains. That's when they really kind of change a lot of the assumptions that they have. So one way to look about the work that we're doing is how do we create more opportunities for people to have these kind of conversations, to have a relationship, a connection with people that think differently across different perspectives. And this is a potential that we do have at the local community. So third kind of builds on the second, but more of a longer term view in terms of how do we build then local capacity for deliberative engagement in our communities. This is going to be kind of a shift in some ways on how things are done in some communities, right? So deliberative engagement, there's lots of different kind of terms for it. Academics like to kind of come up with their own words in many ways. And these are just some of the terms in the literature. They all have some kind of basic features that go together. A lot of it is about the importance of interaction and the importance of kind of going slow, right? That's certainly going to be one of the drawbacks from deliberative engagement, that it is a process that takes a little bit more time. It often takes small groups, so it requires a little bit more capacity. But I do think the more cities build this capacity, that they'll actually see the results, that see the value of going slow in important ways. This is one of the things that from the NCDD 2010 resource guides available online. Just Google it as a about 20-page PDF with some great links. But another kind of key feature of deliberative engagement is that it's particularly thoughtful, right? It's got a pretty high bar. So these are just 7 of the kind of core principles. This is actually a collaborative process with a lot of the national organizations that do this kind of work for the kind of principles of truly kind of deliberative public engagement that meets all these different things. And we kind of talk about these kind of process design points as we kind of go through. There's a lot of commitments of what happens before the meeting and what happens after the meeting, not just what happens during the meeting with these small group discussions. So some of the kind of key components that I'll kind of touch on today that makes kind of deliberative engagement different than kind of typical public engagement. First, just an overall deliberative framing. I often kind of start our meetings talking a little bit about wicked problems, of kind of covering some of the kind of basic notions and framing the issue in a way that really hopefully kind of sets people up to be productive. We talk about kind of different kind of ground rules. We get away from a yes/no, and we try to always have multiple approaches to the issue. We inherently talk about a broad range of actors to kind of tap into the notion of democratic governance, that these problems are kind of best engaged across sectors, public and private and nonprofit. And to start that discussion upstream again before people have made their decisions. We want people walking in concerned about the issue, knowing we need to do something, but they haven't yet kind of achieved certainty on the right thing to do, right? They might walk in with some ideas, but the more they walk in kind of ready to kind of be creative and ready to think about different sides is going to be a powerful thing for the deliberation to work. The second kind of key component is we often have some sort of discussion guide or backgrounder, something for people to react to. There's a lot of kind of research and theory kind of behind this. A lot of what happens here is I'll spend some time before our meetings, what I call making sense of the noise, all these individual kind of voices out there, whether those emails or it's the one at a time on the microphone at city council or things that are on websites or message boards or responses to kind of newspaper articles. And I'll try to make sense of all that within the wicked problems mindset, and then kind of create some sort of discussion guide or background that people can react to. One powerful thing there is it brings lots more voices in the room. One limitation of small groups is you have a small group. You only have 5, maybe 8 people at the table. Instead of relying on their opinions to drive the conversation, you have this discussion guide that you develop from a much broader engagement to kind of frame the issue. Sorry. Yeah. The other power here is that these documents are framed for deliberation, not persuasion. They're framed to help people have a tough conversation and to go and walk through this issue, versus most material is framed for persuasion, framed to kind of convince you on one side or the other, and that can really help change the conversation. There's also this kind of aspect here that it allows for safer conflict. So when you're working together on this document, instead of having to disagree with the people at the table, you're actually kind of working together on this document, right, to improve the document. So you might agree on some parts or disagree on other parts, but it's kind of a safer way to kind of have some of those conversations instead of having directly to kind of reject something that someone said across the table. We try to kind of, as much as possible, have small, diverse representative groups, which takes a lot of work to really get the room diverse in all kind of forms of diversity. But that small group discussion really kind of allows for that learning process, allows for that interaction, allows for that sharing, versus just handing that person a microphone in front of a large group. And then the processes themselves are designed, the kind of questions that we're asking, the work that we're asking them to do, what we're asking them to react to. We're not just asking for their vote. We're not just asking if they're yes or no, why they're for or against something. We're much more asking them to be creative, or if we're looking at some specific solutions, we're asking them to know, why are you for or against this? What are the arguments beneath that? Which is a much kind of deeper dive into kind of some of these issues that they have a chance to at a small group, kind of walking through that, and then we're getting much better information on the back end from that. Think about it, if you look at traditional forms of public engagement, it used to be that government just had to inform citizens at the local level. This is what we're doing and kind of why we're doing it. As kind of some challenges and trust in institutions, we have more and more kind of input processes, whether that's surveys or one time on the microphone, those sort of things. There tends, some people call for much more interaction between government and citizens, that we need to kind of find ways to get beyond just the, one way or maybe both ways, but separate. But even that can be very limited, because it becomes much more of a conversation of what should government do, right? So, and when that happens, we tend to kind of get individual citizens kind of all kind of making demands at government from different perspectives. And often with a controversial issue, that's not the most kind of productive thing that we may have, right? So deliberative engagement is more citizens actually talking to citizens. Instead of them walking out once at a time in the microphone and talking past each other, we actually have them engaged in each other in that discussion. And then, of course, there's lots of people that are inherently involved in that discussion to elevate that discussion, listen to that discussion, kind of think about the move to action eventually with that discussion. So that's the kind of broader model, what it looks like when we talk about deliberative engagement. But again, starting with that citizen-to-citizen deliberation, which is key. So lots of resources out there. Again, I'll mention the NCDD guide, resource guide, which is a very kind of useful document. Lots of live links there, so it's best to get it as an electronic kind of PDF. This is just one tool that they use, these kind of 4 engagement streams. The exploration, conflict transformation, decision-making, collaborative action. The document then has lots of different kind of specific kind of tools and process kind of models to use for each of those as you go through, but they all have the kind of the same base of these small group discussions to work through kind of tough issues together, right? And the last kind of key component I'll mention is deliberative facilitators. And this is kind of one of the hardest things to think about, the long-term capacity for cities. At the Center for Public Deliberation, I have the luxury of having 40 or 50 students that are getting class credit to learn to be facilitators and to learn about collaborative process design, and then they can help us work with all these projects. But most cities aren't going to have the luxury of having 50 trained facilitators willing to help these. I am working to kind of start the program, and I do believe every college and university in the country should have its own kind of CPD or something similar. But other cities can do it different ways, so you can build a cadre of facilitators across city government. You can work with local nonprofit groups, you can community foundations, leadership foundation, those type of things. But I do believe that's going to be one of the important kind of roles, is to build up a cadre of citizens that, again, see their role as elevating the conversation, whether they're kind of officially being facilitators, or sometimes it's useful to have them as participants with that mindset. But how do we build up this capacity so instead of just having the 200 people with one microphone, we actually have 15 separate conversations that are kind of digging into the issues in a much more productive way. Right? So another way of thinking about the kind of deliberative process and how we design projects, I wanted to kind of share this one tool. This is probably one of the most kind of common tools that I've used. I kind of joke that I've drawn this diagram on a coffee table napkin probably a couple hundred times in the last 12 years as people meet to initially explain projects. So this is from Sam Kainer's book, The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making. Very useful book to have on your shelf if you're interested in this kind of work. But he talks about this process of group decision making when we want it to be participatory. We want the people involved to be part of the decision making. And he designed this specifically for organizational communication, but I applied it to community politics, and it works pretty well. But the main issue here is there's kind of 3 stages to think through. And each of these stages require a different kind of communication style, different kind of processes to work. And I think sometimes we kind of lump these all together. So this goes back to thinking about the kind of capacity you need to build in your community for these. The first stage is divergent thinking. You want to get lots of different kind of perspectives. You don't want to close down conversation. You want to get beyond the usual suspects, right? And we have a lot of problems when we cut that off too often, right? So I call it false consensus, that we think we all agree because we didn't let anyone disagree, whether we didn't let them in the room, or if they're in the room, we didn't let them speak, or if they spoke, we shut them down pretty quickly. So these, to really ensure getting beyond false consensus, to have sufficient divergent thinking, how do we make sure voices are heard, right? That we have kind of these openings, that there's different ways to really listen to the public. And I think this is something that cities generally do pretty well, right? We have lots of different mechanisms to do this. We have a strong kind of free speech tradition in the United States. So this thing is we could always do better, getting beyond the usual suspects, getting to different audiences. But this isn't where the biggest problem is. I think the biggest problem is we do a good job of divergent thinking. We have all these ways that people express their individual opinion, but then we don't have a good way of making sense of them, right? So we get right into the groan zone, and then we exit. We make a decision at that point. Think of a controversial city council issue where maybe 100 people showed up at that microphone, but then after that, one at a time microphone, maybe there's some deliberation between council, but then the decision's made. What happens there is everyone who, quote, lost the decision is typically pretty frustrated, right? They don't see a legitimacy in the process. They don't quite feel heard in some ways. And that's because we let everyone kind of speak, but the issue wasn't worked through. And I like the kind of framing of the groan zone here, because if it's a wicked problem, it's going to be tough. And if we're really working through a tough issue, it's going to be difficult at times. I tell my students as I'm training them as facilitators that if your tables are really struggling, well, that means it's working, right? Because they should be struggling in some important ways, right? So avoiding false polarization requires what I think of the deliberative kind of tactics in particular, right? How do we work through these tough issues? How do we understand each other? How do we kind of in small groups work through these different kind of things, right? But there's still kind of one more tension that we have to go on. Because we can do a really good job of divergent thinking, and we can do a really good job of working through the groan zone, and then we can get stuck there. And you notice on this one, we never make the decision point. And this is another kind of challenge to this kind of work, that once we get beyond the simple good versus evil, and we actually put the wickedness in the problem, sometimes that can kind of take away the motivation, right? So how do we kind of have the kind of processes we need on the back end of how do we kind of get out of the groan zone, and how do we start doing that convergent thinking? How do we start prioritizing? How do we start making some decisions? How do we kind of move from talk to action? And that's a whole other kind of skill set that's tied within the deliberative engagement model, tied to collaborative action and a broad range of actors and prioritization. So I'll say, each of those 3 requires a different kind of process. Divergent thinking can be done with traditional methods, can be done with surveys and one at a time on the microphone. The groan zone, I think, does take kind of small group, kind of much more kind of time-intensive kind of processes. And then convergent thinking can work in different ways. If you had a broad kind of groan zone experience in a way, then convergent thinking can be done by a smaller group. It can be done online in some ways, if people prioritizing kind of lists, right? But thinking about long-term projects as those kind of 3 stages in a way can help thinking about the skills and the processes you need. In the end, what we're trying to do is kind of build up what we're really doing with public process. Much public process right now just provides that opportunity for voice or public input, which is critical in the divergent thinking stage. But that's necessary but not sufficient for the kind of conversations and the kind of solutions that we need. So we need process to actually support listening and interaction. Those middle ground ones, right? The small groups to create the opportunities for people that disagree with each other to really interact. And when you have those, you have a chance to kind of build understanding and mutual respect. You get away, those blinders stop dropping down. You start having those aha moments where people realize the people that disagree with them, they're probably still wrong, right? They probably still feel that their ideas are better than theirs, but they see the value of their ideas. They see the reasonableness, and that's a huge move for democracy, for us to understand each other, right? We need process that help differentiate strong and weak arguments. That's not just the most popular arguments or the most easily manipulatable arguments. And I think when you have a strong processes, you start seeing that, right? When we shift from being adversaries to collaborators, we want good ideas, we want good evidence. So you start kind of being able to distinguish between those a little bit better. And then ultimately, we want our public processes to be collaborative learning processes, not just input, but learning, right? And that's going to get us to the point of what we're really looking for, that we have these processes that create for the city collaborative action and co-creation kind of across multiple perspectives, across multiple sectors. So the last 2 I'll do pretty quickly because I wanted to try to keep this under 30 minutes. So I got about 4 more minutes here just to kind of check the 2 kind of longest term things with this. So one is thinking about this distinction between bridging and polarizing institutions. This is some of the work of Robert Putnam with Bowling Alone that some people might be familiar with. We have some organizations that primarily gather around like-minded people, and then we have some organizations that kind of gather people across perspectives. So this is kind of an initial kind of, putting different organizations, both local and national, kind of on that spectrum. I will say it seems like lately everything's kind of shifted up. So our more polarizing institutions, those 3 on the top, have become kind of hyper-polarizing. Some of those scariest stuff, but those ones in the middle that used to be kind of neutral or kind of bipartisan in some ways, are seen as more and more polarizing. And then the ones on the bottom, this is Robert Putnam's work in particular, those local kind of institutions and communities that bring people together across perspectives, have really eroded, have lost membership, or have just become less important. So one of the longer term things that cities need to do is combat this. And at the local level, I think we can. How do we rebuild those organizations on the bottom or create new ones? And how do we get the organizations in the middle, particularly at the local level, to become more bridging? Right? Universities in particular have to be bridging organizations that bring people together and that are seen as a valuable thing from both sides of the political aisle, right? The expertise in the media. Local media can play a very strong, positive, deliberative role if they see their role in that, right? And I do think that that's one way for local media to kind of reinvent itself in the 21st century. Right? And then lastly, and then this is the longest term, it is a little theoretical, but the idea that we need at the local level to start cultivating citizens as kind of wise collaborators. And I'm playing off a new book by political scientist Jason Brennan, Against Democracy. I don't agree with the whole premise of the book. He's basically arguing democracy doesn't seem to work very well because people are too easily manipulated. He wants kind of rule by experts in some ways. But one thing he does do that I like is he talks about these 3 types of citizens. He calls them hobbits, hooligans, and Vulcans. So hobbits are disconnected. They don't want to be involved at all. Hooligans are involved, but involved badly. And then he argues that the ideal is the Vulcan. And if you're a Star Trek fan, a Vulcan is purely unemotional, rational thinker, right? So he argues that democratic theorists forever had said that if you get involved in political issues, it turns hobbits into Vulcans. But he argues all the evidence shows that it turns hobbits into hooligans. And I think I'd agree with him there. But I primarily agree with them because most of our engagement processes that people can get involved in have been adversarial, right? They haven't been deliberative. So if we have deliberative engagement as the kind of primary way we engage, I think we can turn people, but not quite into Vulcans, right? Vulcans is an unreachable ideal. I don't want people to be purely unemotional and rational. Emotion and rationality get tied up together a lot more than people think. So the ideal that I'll strive for is wise collaborators. And this is basically tapping into the best of human nature and trying to kind of suppress kind of the negative, simplistic, good versus evil kind of groupishness of human nature. And to think for a second, what happens if we build up in our communities kind of a cadre of wise collaborators, people that care about the community, that are showing up at public meetings with their primary goal is to elevate the conversation, right? So as we think about, what kind of processes do we do, civic education of building wise collaborators from the beginning, what kind of process do we have to turn hobbits into collaborators and turn hooligans into collaborators, and to kind of reward that. And I think if you look at our City Works 101, our citizen academies, our leadership programs, we could start really kind of building kind of this notion of what happens when you have a significant kind of small but significant portion of your community that really kind of takes on this identity and really helps elevate the conversations. So I'll end with this. I showed this earlier. This is kind of the vicious cycle of looking at social psychology. This is a negative feedback loop that kind of feeds on itself. The good news is, as you start kind of doing these steps, you can develop this virtuous cycle. That when we give people an opportunity for authentic engagement, you'll see that we can start tapping into the best of human nature instead of the worst. That leads to the development of mutual understanding of people kind of across perspectives. And as they start kind of building trust and respect, they start communicating, and the blinders start coming down, and the simplistic narratives start getting challenged. Then all of a sudden, our public processes aren't just public input processes, but our public refinement processes, or public learning processes, or creativity processes that tap into the best of human nature. And then that creates that potential for collaboration and co-creation, which is so critical for our communities to function well in the 21st century. And the good news is the research does show that this is a positive feedback loop, that the more you do this, the easier it will be to do. And you can really build a culture in your community of authentic, deliberative engagement. Thank you.